Like I would drop a video like once per year, and then I will go silent for 3 years, and then in 3 years, so like, oh, I'm back.
We've all been there.
Today is one of those days that you're a content creator because you're on the show.
That's right. We're filling the quota.
Yeah, 3 years of silence now after this, right?
Welcome to the Cables to Clouds podcast, your one-stop shop for all things hybrid and multi-cloud networking. Now, here are your hosts, Tim, Chris, and Alex.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Cables to Clouds podcast. As always, my name is Tim McConaughey at Juan Golbez on Twitter. With me, as always, are my co-hosts, Alex Perkins at Bumps on the Wire on Twitter and Chris Miles at BGP Main on Twitter. We have with us a special guest this week to kind of talk about some of the transitioning from network engineering on-prem to the cloud and some challenges and things that he does to help customers that are moving to the cloud today. So go ahead and introduce yourself, Dmitry Figol. We've got him from AWS.
Hey everyone, I'm Dmitry, Senior Cloud Infrastructure Architect at AWS Professional Services. I help customers design and implement scalable infrastructure on AWS. My main area of expertise is networking, cloud networking specifically. Yeah, I'm one of the authors of Cisco DevNet Expert exam, occasional conference speaker, and occasional content creator.
Occasionally, once in a while.
Yeah, yeah. Like and I would drop a video like once per year, and then I will go silent for 3 years, and then in 3 years, so like, oh, I'm back.
We've all been there.
Today is one of those days that you're a content creator because you're on the show.
That's right. We're filling the quota.
Yeah, 3 years of silence now after this, right?
That's right. We'll open the cave 3 years from now, and you can come back out. Thanks for joining us, Dmitry. So, tell us a little bit, if you would, about because obviously a lot of people already might know you, especially in the network engineering community, but maybe not the cloud community yet. So, tell us a little bit about your background in network engineering and kind of what led you to end up where you are now with AWS doing cloud networking.
Yeah, so I've been working at Cisco for around 7 years, where I was doing a lot of different things. I started in tech, and then I was in sales for some time, and then transitioned to like network automation stuff, and then eventually to some parts of software development as well. And probably during the last 5 years at Cisco, I was focusing specifically on network automation. It was my thing. I really wanted to know everything there is to know about that, and I was exploring a lot of different things. And then I think what has happened is I realized that, like, I personally stopped believing in it, I guess. That's my issue with that. Is, like, there have been talks about, so first of all, like, some people were doing parts of like CLI automation for years. Like technically it was nothing new. There was stuff around things like Yang, some like new tooling, like even Yang 10 years later, I don't think it's like really went to a level where like everyone is familiar with it, or the tooling around it that makes sense. So what I think has happened is, there was some hype around it, and some of it is useful, but it also requires a lot of investment into that. Like you're essentially asking a person to do 2 jobs at once, like network engineering and software development. And frankly, not many companies were really willing to pay for that, for 2 skills at once, right? It's like, network engineer who knows some, YAML, Ansible, and a little bit of Python. But like, I haven't really seen, except of some cases, right, where proper software development life cycles and practices were really came into network automation world. So at some point, and like over the years, I didn't really see that being like evolving. It was like more of the same. It's like, okay, it would be nice that you folks not only do all this OSPF BGP stuff, but also write Python for it, right?
Yeah, sure.
And at some point I realized it's just, I want something different. I want to do something else. Like I stopped believing in it. And that's where I made decision that I'm going to leave it, and I'm going to leave it behind myself. Like I'm going to close this chapter of my life. I would stop going to like Cisco lives. I would stop tweeting about how I dislike Ansible and things like this. And that's it. And then I found another role at AWS where it was something completely different. And I never looked back. But then eventually networking came back for me, right? And I was like, okay, I know on-premises networking, right? So it was kind of easier for me to build some of this cloud networking knowledge on top of it and become really good at it. So I kind of use it to my advantage.
Yeah, I think it's like the IPv6 adoption, right? Like everybody's been talking about it forever. It's like, when is it actually going to get adopted? And I mean, network automation has not been around as long as people have been saying IPv6 is going to take over. But it's still like a similar kind of trajectory, it feels like. So I agree with you there for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I remember I used to do like Twitch streams that were like ridiculous amount of time. It was like 6 hours long Twitch streams that you would do. And I just remember thinking like respect for being able to focus on something for that period of time. I mean, the stuff that you were doing was really awesome, but I totally get where, you were like kind of wanting to lead the way and advance the industry, if you would, but it just wasn't ready to follow behind, I guess. It just wasn't ready to come with you. So I can understand that. So okay. So can I just, before we lead into it then, what was it about, say, AWS or cloud in general that you were looking at like, okay, this is where I should be instead? Like, if you don't mind me asking.
To be honest, I didn't knew that that's what I'm going to do next. That wasn't necessarily my plan. It's just I had an opportunity. My friend joined AWS just some time ago, and so I'm based here in Poland, and they're starting evolving and growing the center here in Poland, specifically for AWS professional services. So, and at some point he said, hey, like, this is what we do. Do you want to join? And I said, yeah, why not? Right. So then like a little bit later, I realized that, well, probably even beforehand, I knew that I wanted to be closer to business in terms of developing applications and building applications, having like proper architectures in place. That's something I liked. I liked drawing diagrams and understanding how different components of IT systems work and how to design them properly. So, and it seems like it was a good fit, right, when I joined.
Isn't it so interesting? Because it's funny because, of course, as when we were on-prem networking people, it's not like the applications were really that far away, but organizationally, it felt much further away. And I don't know if you guys agree, but like when I was a network engineer, like the apps could have been on another planet. Like, I mean, I knew they existed and I knew that they were important, that they had requirements and the network had to meet them. But like, I couldn't have told you what those were, might be on, right? But when you go to the cloud, the apps are like right there. Like everything you build with the cloud from a networking perspective is in support of that. It just feels different. I don't know what you guys think about that.
To me, it's like there's two approaches that I think everybody has in this. It's when you first get into networking, you're so far away from the apps, but it's like as you get more experienced, you kind of just grow closer to them. But then also right on top of it, cloud just really puts them front and center, and it's more. So it's like networking people seem to approach it from both angles at the same time, I think.
Yeah, I think it's partially due to that transition from the monolithic type of infrastructure versus, even if you do a lift and shift, it's still true. Like the app is immensely closer to you for some reason in the cloud. And I think I think it has to do with that modernization piece as well, right? And the fact that there's no, you're not focusing on the networking layer and then the virtualization layer. It's like all that is kind of I hate saying dumbed down, but it's kind of dumbed down in a lot of these situations, right? There's not overly complex networking and virtualization options where you can really get yourself into trouble, right? So they've oversimplified a lot of these things.
Okay. So actually, that's a good segue. Dmitry, you mentioned as part of your, your job at AWS, you help customers with design and architecture. Are the kind of customers that you're working with, what kind of challenges from a networking perspective are you usually seeing and kind of helping them solve? Like, what do you see as like the same place where people are stubbing their toes a lot of time, or like what ends up being a lot of the problems to solve from a networking perspective?
Well, first is the mindset and understanding that networking on AWS and networking on-prem are different things. And the constructs that you are exposed to, they might seem familiar, but they're also not exactly the same. And that you shouldn't really take what you know on premise and apply that knowledge on AWS directly. Like you really need to understand some of these components in order to build good architectures. So yeah, there are a couple of things that I see where I see there is a lot of confusion about, especially when some folks haven't had a lot of AWS experience before. So things like availability zones, for example, right? Or security groups. And some other areas. Do we want to deep dive into that at the moment, or?
I mean, yeah, like some examples of what you're helping with these people with. Like that'd be great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, for example, let's say you have a number of data centers on premises, and maybe they are let's say one data center or maybe two data centers in France, let's say, and a couple, I don't know, in Germany, and etc. So, and then let's say you want to do lift and shift migration to AWS, or in general, you want to build something similar. And then you have to understand, well, what AWS region you're going to use, what availability zone you're going to use, or how many of those. And that's like one where like this one of the confusion is that availability zones are different data centers, right? That are not very far from each other, but also not very close to each other. So they are not affected by like power outages and floods, etc. So let's say with a distance up to 100 kilometers away from each other, they're designed in a way where you have redundancy, where you have resiliency, where you can actually do synchronous replication of your data, simply because the latency there is not that high. But then if, let's say, you were to take your on-premise data centers and then put them in another AWS regions, maybe let's say, I don't know, Frankfurt and then something else. Now you are in different AWS regions, like some different rules are applied. Like you cannot stretch some things across different regions. Like many AWS services are actually regional. So like your VPC and EC2 is regional constructs. So like you just kind of just stretch it, right? So, and one other thing is there are many ways to build highly resilient applications in single region that customer I would encourage to explore first before even going multi-region. then just because doing multi-region creates a lot of additional challenges. And not only in terms of like latency, which leads to potentially asynchronous replication of your data, but then you have to think about, well, how do you monitor it properly? Where are you going to put your monitoring, in what region? What happens if there is a problem with monitoring in that one region? Do you have another observability point? You probably will have some dependencies, things like this that are not obvious. So yeah, like focusing on building your application resilient across different AZs within a single region is probably one of the things that I would suggest looking into more to make sure that like you did everything you could.
Do you have a lot of customers that come to you and are like, the very first thing they say to you is, Dmitry, we need multi-region because multi-region means more resilient? Like, is that what you mean? Like, are people not aware of the different resiliency options that they could be leveraging in AWS? Is that what...
It's different for different customers. Very often,
of course,
a lot of these decisions are made before I even join the call, right?
Of course.
And then it's like it's really hard to have that kind of conversation much later, I guess.
Yeah. We're those of us who've worked in delivery understand that very well.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like it being, because I've worked in professional services as well for a lot of my career, and I do understand a lot of times you are handed something that isn't the most opportunistic or best designed in the forefront thing. Or do you find yourself having conversations like that about things like about latency, about MTU, things like that people were not considering with multi-region architectures? Because I know it's crazy how complicated things get the second you want to do multi-region, right?
Yeah, so not really about MTUs, but latency does come into play, and sometimes it comes into discussion so much so late that like you already built your physical direct connect circuits to your on-premise architecture. Now we are discussing latency. And they're like, okay, this is not the numbers that we expected. Well, probably some tests should have been done much earlier. Yeah. So some anecdotes I remembered. It's interesting that when you have an application on premises and you are on LAN where you have sub-millisecond latency, and then you move part of your component somewhere else like AWS, right? And then maybe like one part of application is in AWS and one part is on premises. And then suddenly between your components is not sub-millisecond latency, maybe it's 15 or 25, right? And then later it's like, someone complains that, okay, my API request response take 1.5 seconds. And then you start doing some investigation with like packet capturings and stuff. And then you realize that there are like 15 or 30 round trips going on. And then like, of course, like those, you have never seen that, because if it's sub-millisecond latency, is like you don't even notice that you did 15 times back and forth, right? But then if you move components apart, then it's like, okay, now it's much more noticeable.
Poor application design has been covered by the network for so many years. You know what I mean? Like these database calls where every time you try to make a call to the database, you're grabbing these giant tables, or you're asking for 400 different pieces of information with your database calls. Just really shitty application writing has been covered by overbuilding the network for so many years. And unfortunately, like you said, if you go to the cloud and you start loose coupling this stuff and putting latency in between them, the cracks start showing pretty fast.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is once it happens, that's when people really start thinking about it and looking at it, right? Because that brings something to mind. I was actually just talking with a customer not too long ago. the network team noticed that, they stood up these direct connects, they moved things into a VPC, and there's like one process on this application that they moved that runs very often, probably tens and 20 times a day, and it has over 1 million transactions for one single process. And it's just like, and they're hairpinning that up and down every transaction, and it's just insane.
Yikes.
Yeah. So that definitely does happen.
Yeah, just to back up just a sec, you mentioned like knowing just the basics, like availability zones. Just something I'm observing, like people that are like traditional on-prem network engineers, stuff like redundancy between data centers isn't a forefront thought, right? Like it's usually something that comes afterwards, or like I know I've been at plenty of places where you have like 2 data centers, but they're not actually redundant. Like one is just kind of like for separate applications, and then there's like giant exercises to make it so that you can have like redundancy between
whole projects to
exactly
to deploy the apps there and stuff.
Giant drills to be like, can we even fail over here? Yeah. So I just thought that's a good example, and I bet that's some of the things that you see customers having challenges with, right? Is just getting around that mentality in the first place.
Yep. So maybe I could talk about another misconception, or something that's maybe not misconception, but not very familiar to folks. So I think security groups take people by surprise. So for those who don't know, security group would be a stateful firewall on pretty much almost every network interface on AWS. And then you have a rule, inbound rule, for example, you open some port, so you can accept an inbound connection, but then outbound connection will go through as well, since it's stateful firewall. And again, like this comes up a lot in like lift and shift migrations, where people are not really familiar with firewalls, like these firewall rules on that level, like instance level or VM level firewalls, like are pretty rare, right? Like you would often have firewall rules somewhere at the boundary of your subnet, or something like that. And that often creates some challenges as well. So like you don't have the same rule on premise, like you suppose that everything on the same subnet can just communicate with each other on any port, right? But then you move to AWS, and you are required to put those security groups and design them in the first place. Like there is some confusion there. So like this firewall is moved much more closer to your instance. So you have to take that into account when you are doing this kind of migrations.
Yeah. Do you find that customers aren't aware that the SGs exist, or just that they assume they would be kind of open unless I explicitly deny stuff? Like,
see, it again depends on who are you talking to in the organization, right? Because there is more often than not, there are some group of people who are championing being on the cloud, and their level of familiarity with some of these concepts are much higher. But then there would be also potentially network folks or application folks for whom all of this is completely new. They have never done anything on AWS, right? So it depends, right? So with those folks, like they could be surprised that, okay, my server has moved, but I didn't really specify in some kind of template that I needed this, like my server is listening on that port and this no longer works. Why is that, right?
That was a huge problem on-prem too. Like if there was a lot of times when you have the testing environment for the devs, and this happened to me all the time when I was an enterprise engineer, we'd have the testing environment for the devs that was set up with the same VLANs and everything as the prod. But of course they didn't want to pay for the security infrastructure. So there weren't firewalls in the middle of it. So dev would run their stuff. They would change whatever they wanted to change in terms of source, destination, programs talking to each other. They do it and it all work, and they push to prod. And of course it broke immediately because of all the firewall infrastructure that was part of the actual network. We hadn't gotten any firewall requests to update any of the stuff because the devs didn't know anything about that. Right. So it sounds very similar.
This is my exact day to day, like that you just described exactly what I deal with all the time. So yes, thank you for that memory.
I mean, it's really important for application folks to understand how their components actually work, right? Have diagrams in place, have that documented, right?
But when they lift and shift, man, that so often they have no idea, right? When you're pulling it off out of my data center, like I don't even know where the stuff is in my data center. I just know I write this name and X talks to Y, and there's thousands of lines of code with it, and we're going to lift and shift that into the cloud, and they have no idea what's talking to what, right? You just have to.
Yeah, oftentimes when things are reported, like, oh, we think there's a network problem with this, and like, okay, I mean, what TCP, UDP ports are you using? It's always like, I don't know. Like,
yeah,
no one knows.
Right?
Yeah, you tell us. And like, but that also kind of exponentially becomes a problem when you move things into the cloud, like you said, Dmitry, where now there's a pretty much a firewall on every single network interface card that is out there.
Microsegmentation, right? Pretty much.
Yeah. L4 microseg. Yeah.
L4.
Yeah. But I'm curious, are you seeing issues with the customers that you talk to? Because now that becomes kind of part of what they need to make sure they're orchestrating when they're building in the cloud, right? If you're building purpose-built security groups for specific use cases or for applications, they need to know that, and then they need to know how it gets applied, how it gets put on EC2 instances whenever they're spun up. Do you see customers having issues with sprawl of that? And that's like a net new element that they need to deal with now. Are they struggling with that?
I would say it's mix again. Like that happens as well.
Yeah, sprawl, or do they just make like a custom one and then apply it everywhere that just allows traffic, right? Like same problems everywhere.
Yeah, so I actually more often see that as like that's being fixed unless some specific use cases, like maybe still like if it's component of the same application, maybe we will allow communication on like every port. But more often than not, I actually see that's getting fixed. Simply because, let's say you migrated a server and then something doesn't work. And then there is some kind of troubleshooting process, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, you didn't inform us that there was this flow. So that flow gets added rather than like just some blanket statements. So like I see security is usually being taken quite seriously, and also simply because like it enforces you to interact with this kind of elements. Like you have to. It's like much easier to do it right from the beginning in that case, rather than just allow and then like you will never fix that.
Okay. Yeah, I think Is there another anecdotal kind of piece that you wanted to cover, or we can kind of move on to the next thing if you want?
I think we can move on to another thing, and that is load balancing. I think is something that comes up. So this is more to networking folks. I think there is something that very often networking folks are used to is some kind of VIP concept on load balancers, right? And the way load balancers work on AWS is that every load balancer node will get its own IP. There isn't really VIP concept there, right? And some of these like changes in like how you think about resiliency of that load balancer nodes come into play. Like you cannot use like one IP like for everything, for every single AZ, etc., and that you have to rely on DNS because there is an on AWS load balancing specifically, there is integration between Route 53 DNS and the load balancer, where it would health check the load balancer nodes. And if there is a problem with either load balancer or targets behind load balancer, we would take out the DNS entry from the IP address from the DNS entry, right? So that's how you achieve that resiliency. And on premises, sometimes it's different, right? You would use some kind of VIP concept and you just have single static IP as an entry point for your application. So sometimes that comes as well of like, okay, I want to have this single IP for my application, but that's not directly translatable, and like would not be a best practice to even do that on AWS. You would want to rely on DNS for that.
Yeah, I think I'm just curious because obviously moving to the cloud, just as you've pointed out now, there is, I feel like that it has caused people to have to kind of refactor their DNS implementations to be a little bit more robust and using, like you said, multiple IPs per entry as opposed to a virtual IP or something like that. But one thing is DNS, I feel like on-prem, especially in some of these situations with mission critical applications, we're used to building like, hey, this failover needs to be sub-second, right? Things need to be very fast. However, DNS typically, time to live on a DNS record is relatively slow, right? I think default is typically like 300 seconds or something. Do you see, how do you talk about situations like this with like failover and things like that? Are you seeing people need to adjust expectations or things like that?
So it didn't come up in the conversation that I had that much, to be honest. Though there are some services that if you are looking for non-DNS based failover that can do that, like Global Accelerator, for example. So it's just like I didn't have those kind of conversations probably yet.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of where I was leading though, is like you need to pick the right tool for the job, right? So if that's something that you need, it's important to know what services are there.
I think in general, I would say I would want to add that it's important to understand fundamentals of pretty much anything. Like when you can get to like a packet level exchange, or maybe at least like an actual request response and understanding what's going on there, like what would be the header, why you're doing so many round trips, or like why this source IP is being changed to something else, then like why it's being put in X forwarded for, like all kind of these things. Like if you start focusing on fundamentals, it really helps to operate, to design and troubleshoot, regardless if you are on cloud or on premises.
Yeah.
The packet walk is always king.
Yeah, especially at the network level. And it doesn't matter if you're on premises or in the cloud. If like we were just talking about picking the right tool for the job, to pick the right tool for the job, you have to understand what the application is doing, what the expectation is. Like for the X forwarder, do I need the X forwarder? Like, is that something, like, do I need information in the X forwarder to be persistent? Like that's an option, right? I can pick yes or no. Like that, is there a reason I need it to have it? Does the app expect it? Like that's the level of detail you got to get to be able to pick the right load balancer as an example, right? Okay. I think that's a really good discussion on this. And I think it leads us kind of into the last little thing we wanted to touch on before we wrap up, which is, transitioning from on-prem to the cloud is obviously a huge undertaking, right? And there's a lot of skill changes that carry over. And we've talked about this from the beginning, I think, even from our first or second episode. There's also skills that you have to like just start from zero with, like, which is understanding what options exist in the cloud. So, how do you think people should how do you think people should get started? I mean, obviously you had to do it. So what was your kind of way to pick up with the cloud stuff?
So I would say the way I would start today is trying to build some kind of application on cloud and use different compute and storage options. It can be very simple. Like you don't have to like do something from scratch. You can even take some Docker images, container images someone else has built. Like you don't have to write code yourself. But I would take an application, like I would understand its components, and then I would build it in the cloud. And then I would try to make it better, make it more resilient, to understand security groups, to understand availability zones, how would load balancing would behave. And I would probably start with like just EC2 instances and things like this. But then once you become more familiar, you can transition to something else, like how do you deploy containers natively, or maybe even you don't really want to think about all of this logical networks and VPC stuff, and you would just use serverless services like Lambda and things like this, so that you never have to define an IP address in the cloud. Yeah, that would be probably my the first area. And then second area, as you go along, like once maybe you build it, I would automate what I've built in the console, just so I can replicate it at scale. Because most likely that's the way you would want to build it in your company. Like it doesn't really make sense to do ClickOps for everything, especially if you have like tens or hundreds or thousands of your applications. It would be so much easier to just, write some infrastructure as code and be done with it.
I feel like we have to ask though, just given history, what is your preferred method of automating in the cloud?
That's a good question. And I think all of the tools have room for improvement. Let's put it this way.
It's the best answer.
All right. That's a fair point. I was just curious if you were like a AWS CLI guy or Terraform or CloudFormation or all of the above or whatever.
Yeah, so it's part of my role. I use all of that, right? It really depends on what customer wants. So
gotcha.
For one customer, I could do one tool, and then for another customer, another tool. It doesn't really matter in the end.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so I think we are just about ready to wrap up. Any final thoughts or something that you wanted to share, Dmitry, before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I wanted to briefly share my favorite database networking service. And I wanted to make sure that people go ahead and check it out if they haven't, which is AWS Private Link. So, like very briefly, it allows you to connect to another application regardless in which VPC account it is. Like it doesn't require you to connect to networks to each other. So I think it's very impressive, and it can solve a lot of interesting use cases. So that's kind of one thing. And second thing is I would encourage folks, especially interested in high availability across AZs and load balancing, to check out the reInvent talk from last year about zonal shift, Arc zonal shift. Okay. That's something that again, like I went through it and like my mind was completely blown. I was like, okay, now I want to share this knowledge to anyone who is willing to listen. And even if they don't, I will talk to them anyway until they don't want to talk to me anymore.
Nice. Okay, we'll make sure we get the link and get that in the show notes for that talk.
Yeah, we will. I'll say we didn't discuss this before hitting record, and as soon as you said I wanted to discuss my favorite AWS service, I'll be honest, Private Link was not at the top of my list.
I didn't expect
I'm surprised that's where you went. But at the same time, Private Link's really powerful. People have built entire businesses
out of it, yeah.
So,
like SaaS business basically out of it. Yeah, absolutely. I would have, honestly, I was waiting for you to say Lattice, but I wasn't sure.
No, I was just going to ask one last question real quick. And it was going to be, what do you think of things like VPC Lattice? And do you see those as more tools for the application team or networking team?
So I think it's very, very interesting service. It's a relatively recent addition to networking services on AWS, and it does solve a lot of cool. It does have a lot of cool use cases there, and I think it's both. I think it appeals a lot to application folks who like don't want to, like, maybe for whatever reasons you already have your VPCs using the same IP addresses everywhere, and you just want to focus on connecting your microservices together. So I think it's worth exploring, and it has its uses. One thing I will add, since you asked, so it can actually do, like, on one side, one application, one service uses IPv4, and then another side uses IPv6. Right. So that part is also really, really cool. So like you can bridge gap between like V4, V6, regardless. So that speaks to me as a networking guy.
Yeah, we had Alexandra Wiedesch come on, and I think that was one of her main. That was one of her main use cases for it. Was like migrating from V4 to V6.
Yeah, we got a really cool demo from them showing that not migration, but interoperability rather as well. It's a really cool use case, especially as a network guy. I totally agree. That's just a nerd knob. That's fun to turn, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, any final thoughts from you guys, Chris, Alex?
Nope, I'm good. Thanks for coming on, Dmitry.
Yeah, definitely appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, folks.
No worries. Well, okay, so this has been the Cables to Clouds podcast. If you like what you heard and or saw, please subscribe to us on social media. Buy our breakfast cereal, order our stuff from Etsy, book some time with Alex on your dating app of choice. And we'll see you all next time. Hi, everyone. It's Tim, and this has been the Cables to Clouds podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe to us in your favorite podcast catcher, as well as subscribe and turn on notifications for our YouTube channel to be notified of all our new episodes. Follow us on socials at Cables2Clouds. You can also visit our website for all the show notes at cables2clouds.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.